I want to welcome you all here tonight. I also really want to thank our student union, STUN, for sponsoring this event, and also for changing up the format. This is really kind of a nice, intimate format, and I hear that we're going to have a conversation, so it won't be a lecture per se, but it'll be a talk and then a conversation. Also, please, for those of you just coming in, there are plenty of seats up front. Please join us. It's my pleasure to welcome you here. This evening, we're joined by architect, writer, and critical spatial practitioner, Markus Miessen. In the Oxford English Dictionary, participation is defined as the process or fact of sharing in an action, sentiment, etc., active involvement in a matter or event, especially one in which the outcome directly affects those taking part. When I first came across Miessen's book, The Nightmare of Participation, Crossbench Praxis as a Mode of Criticality, this volume, which we have in SCI-Arc's library, so please check it out, I paused to think about what the title suggests and to ask myself what would potentially be nightmarish about involvement. Isn't involvement usually a positive thing, I thought? So the title immediately piqued my curiosity. Miessen's work asks us to attend to the ways in which we are called to participate, by whom and in whose interest. The book reflects on the agency of post-consensual modes of political engagement, asking how might more informed and more aware ways of sharing in an action alter the course of decision-making and change how we work as architects and as spatial actors. What possible outcomes emerge through situating one's practice within the frictional realm, the friction, not the fiction, it could be the fiction too, but the frictional realm that resides between diverse fields of knowledge and ways of knowing. Miessen asks us to consider how might architectural thinking, a term that I thought was interesting, that we use here a lot at SCI-Arc, that Markus also uses in his texts, how might architectural thinking be mobilized to productively disrupt and offer alternatives to what has commonly been referred to as participatory practice, so that we might align more closely with the act of sharing found in the definition of participatory that I read at the beginning. Miessen's characterization of his way of doing work in the world eschews the delineations that are often drawn between researching, designing, theorizing, and activating. He says, quote, "The way that I use projects, material, and writings in order to develop a theory of conflictual participation could be compared to the way certain archives are structured, not like a library, but an accumulation of different species of knowledge and matter congregated into a single physical container." Markus Miessen's work provocatively calls on the architectural thinker and the spatial practitioner to search, to research again, to listen, to speak, to project, and to act. Markus Miessen is the director of Studio Miessen. In 2021, Miessen was appointed Professor of Urban Regeneration at the University of Luxembourg, where he holds the chair of the city of Esch. Miessen has previously taught at the AA in London, the Berlage Institute, has been a Harvard GSD Fellow, and has held professorships at the Städelschule Frankfurt and USC. He received his PhD from the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths in London, supervised by Eyal Weizmann. The initiator of the participation tetralogy, his work revolves around questions of critical spatial practice, institution building, and spatial politics. As a spatial consultant, he currently works with the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism. He previously worked with the European Commission, non-governmental organizations, the Republic of Slovenia during their presidency of the EU Council, as well as numerous cultural and art institutions worldwide. Amongst many other books and writings, Miessen is the author, as I said, of The Nightmare of Participation and Crossbenching Towards Participation as Critical Spatial Practice. He has edited volumes such as Paraplatforms on the Spatial Politics of Right-Wing Populism and The Archive as a Productive Space of Conflict. Together with Nicholas Hirsch, he is the editor of the book series Critical Spatial Practice, Agonistic Assemblies on the Spatial Politics of, Agonistic Assemblies on the Spatial Politics of Horizontality is the title of tonight's talk and conversation, and also the title of Miessen's forthcoming book published by Stenberg Press. So please join me in welcoming Markus Miessen and also welcoming our faculty, Masha Hupalo and Ari Topolson, who is a fourth-year student here at SCI-Arc. So good evening, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very nice introduction. I have one request. Do you think you could turn the light down a little bit? That would be great. Thank you so much. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about tonight is the new book. But what I'm trying to do is I'm going to try to frame this both in the sense of my practice, but also in terms of what I've been writing about specifically on matters of participation over the last 15 years. And what I want to start with is to tell you a little bit about this concept of cross-benching that was briefly mentioned just before. So I've really been interested in participation, not so much from the point of view of, let's say, an all-inclusive mode, but rather from the idea of what it means as an individual practitioner to reach out. And one analogy that I used for this is this concept of cross-benching, which is something that originally comes from the British House of Lords, which I will go into in a minute, and hopefully be able to explain how this actually relates to the question of audiences. So, as it was already mentioned, I basically divide my time, very roughly speaking, between the studio, which is also doing spatial design projects, writing and teaching. And especially my writing and research, basically since 2005, I've been, which is now shockingly almost 20 years, I've been really concentrating on basically two strands of research. So one is relating to issues of participation, and the other one is relating to questions of assembly. And for me, what's very interesting right now is this kind of question of how to actually integrate them. So how they actually become spatial. And the trajectory of research was basically developed over a series of publications that I started working on in 2005, with the first one called Did Someone Say Participate? The second one called The Violence of Participation, The Nightmare of Participation, and then the kind of short summary, one might say, or the conceptual framing, which is called cross-benching, which is this book. And this book directly takes as an analogy the British House of Lords. So what you can see on the kind of bottom section, there's these three rows that sit perpendicular to all the other rows in this parliament. And what's really important to understand is that I'm not making a kind of political statement here. So this is not me saying that the particular, let's say, politics of the House of Lords are interesting or more relevant than others, but I'm literally looking at the space and the way that these individuals are seated. And what's also very important is that they're individuals rather than that they're part of a particular group, because the crossbenchers in the House of Lords, they only represent themselves. So they're not part of a political fraction. So very broadly speaking, as you see in the image, they're neither part of the left nor the right, but they're there for whatever particular reason that they've been asked to represent themselves there. What's very interesting for me is that because they only represent themselves, they also don't have to go through a kind of pre-consensual debate within the party or within a particular political alignment. So they can basically speak up or speak out for themselves. And in terms of the research, one of my earliest questions was really what we mean when we talk about participation, because at the time when I was started to get involved in this, which was at the kind of tail end of my studies, which was in 2004, so this was slightly after the 90s, and in the 90s there was this kind of very interesting phenomenon that all of a sudden lots of practitioners, especially in the art world, started to talk about participation, and also there were a lot of, let's say, inclusive projects. It was never really quite clear like who was talking, who it was addressing, what the audiences were, what the political kind of also shadow tactics behind this were. And one thing that was very evident, especially in the UK where I studied, was that there was also certain misuse of this term, especially by the Labour government at the time. So this is not me blaming Labour, but this is just me saying that there were, let's say, that Tony Blair invented a couple of very interesting strategies to also misuse this term, particularly to develop structures that would then help him to basically politically legitimize other things that they were doing. And so what I was trying to work on was the question of what actually happens when you think about participation, not as, you know, bringing people around the table, but thinking about yourself as the participant and thinking about yourself as the person who's really trying to force him or herself into a different political scenario. And this was, let's say, at least at the time, now the things have changed, I would say, quite considerably, but at the time, there was, let's say, a certain romanticization of the term participation, and this was where my critique started. And then there was another part that was really important for me, was the question of mandate, and especially what happens in terms of self-initiated practices. So this is something that hopefully becomes a little bit clearer when I talk about projects. It was already mentioned before that there was, let's say, a kind of critique of the issue of consensus, especially consensus building when it comes to political frameworks, and how dissensus can also be used as a productive form of conflict. So the research at the time was basically built around three kind of main questions. The first one was about responsibility and how to assume it. It was also about authorship and the question of collaborative practices, and agency, and the question of, very broadly speaking, the role of the architect, but also thinking about the architect at the time as not a good doer, which for me was really problematic, because this was actually the kind of role framing that formal politics was trying to kind of implement, but rather to think of a, let's say, interrogation practice. So, in German, unfortunately, there's a very good word for this, which is Einmischung, which very roughly translates into these three things. So proactive practice, getting involved, and practicing as a productive irritant. So this practice lies somewhere between these three terms. So the second strand of research that I was mentioning is this one on assembly, and particularly what I call cultures of assembly, which is now also the general framing of my chair in Luxembourg. I really love this quote by Alison Arieff. What's wrong with politics? Let's start with the benches. And we've already briefly started with the benches by me explaining this particular section of the House of Lords. So you can see mostly old men sitting there in a kind of quasi-relaxed mode. As I said, it's an analogy. I'm neither interested in the politics of these guys nor the general kind of political framing of the House of Lords, which is actually deeply problematic. But I'm really interested in this kind of in-between section. So here, let's say the thesis is more about the role and the role one plays within a particular audience. The second framing, or the second thesis, one could say, is about proximity, which is actually what this book is about, that I will talk about in a minute. And proximity both in a sense of, let's say, social gathering, but also in terms of formal politics and the becoming of formal politics. So here we have a photograph of the House of Commons, which probably most of you are more aware of, or you've probably seen this rather than this one, because this doesn't usually make it so much into the media. And what I find super interesting about the House of Commons is the way that it produces a certain choreography, so through objects. So you see this table, you've probably seen political discussions in this space. You have the two political opponents sitting across the table from one another, and when it's your turn to talk, you basically get up, start approaching the other person, and you do it in a, let's say, quite confrontational way, which, at least to my knowledge, it's the only parliament in the world, or the only, let's say, political, the only formal political setting where this is the case. You also have the table as an object with all these kind of weirdly constructed elements on top, which of course have a lot of history to them, but they're more like kind of placekeepers in a way. So the moment that I started working in Luxembourg, which was in the beginning of 21, I've also heard that here, I think the school was closed for quite some time, so it was the same in Luxembourg, so it was a very weird moment to start. So I actually decided that right from the beginning I would actually spend some of the time on setting up a space in the city to use the time before the students would return, so to speak. So we created this space, which is a kind of, let's say, a hybrid between a workspace, a gathering space, a gallery space, and a space where basically we do all our public programming. So this is, as the general framing of the chair, it's called Cultures of Assembly. And basically what we do there is, it's a kind of mix, let's say, of a community agency. It's a research space in the city, because the campus is located just outside of the city. So it was very important for me, if we're talking about urban issues and if we're working with different, let's say, social complexities, that you can't sit in a campus that's outside the city. You really have to be there, and you have to really also go in a kind of conversation mode with the general public. So this is what this interface was basically designed for. And we basically have this table that we found from the late 70s, which is our main tool of conversation across audiences from the city. And what we have as a kind of general setting is a monthly event called the ASH Clinics, which is basically a format where we invite different stakeholders and constituencies from the city of Ash to basically discuss with us issues of current relevance in terms of the urban development of the city. I mean, I'm aware that I don't have so much time, but maybe just to briefly contextualize this city of Ash that probably no one of you have ever heard of. I mean, I hope that you've heard of Luxembourg, but it's also not quite likely that you've been there. So it's a very interesting situation there, because it's almost like a kind of city-state. I mean, of course, it's bigger than the city, but essentially there's only one city, which is Luxembourg City. And then there's Ash, which is the second city in the south. And this area in the south, which is called the Kabinett, is the working class kind of territory, let's say, where most of the steel production actually took place. So this is actually why Luxembourg got so incredibly rich, because of the steel production. And now in the last 20 years or 25 years, they went through this hardcore transition from basically heavy industry to, I mean, mostly finance, but also legal and generally services and knowledge. And so this is what the new university is basically doing, because the university has only existed for 15 years. And they've moved it to the south in order to basically spearhead this kind of transition there. And this is all now, of course, to make it even more complicated, happening within the context of the transition movement until 2050. So there's a lot of work to be done, and this work, from my understanding, can only be done together with the people of the region. So this is why we've created this space, and this is how we're trying to do it. And so we're really reaching out in all sorts of directions. So here, for example, you see the head of the chief of the police for the south of the country, with whom we've been debating different issues regarding the social services, which is also one thing that we have as a kind of, let's say, general roundtable situation where we also invite all the different social services from the city. We've also started a while ago a virtual platform, which you can visit if you like, culturesofassembly.org, which also has a podcast program. And we also create this kind of physical and virtual archive, which basically archives all the different activities that are happening in the space and in the city. So to briefly, I'm going to have two more sections. So one is going to talk briefly about the book, and one is going to talk about the spatial projects that start to interlink with these two, let's say, subjects, both of participation and assembly. So the book is basically the outcome of a very long research trajectory that started in 2010, that I did that started as a project at the GSD together with Joseph Kremer, with whom I was doing a fellowship. And we basically decided to use the money to do a research project in Kuwait, where at the time I was setting up a kind of an informal institution called the Winter School Middle East. And we used the resources to basically produce kind of like a documentary film. It's like a 2-channel video, not very long. It's about 7 minutes long. And it's investigating one particular spatial phenomenon, which is called Diwaniya, which I will talk about in a minute. So this is how the book started, or the interest actually in assemblies. And at the same time, of course, there was talking about agonism and the question of, let's say, social gathering, always an interest in agonistic pluralism, which, as probably most of you know, is a kind of concept that originates, let's say, from the thinking of Chantal Mouffe and also her various books on the matter. And I've worked with her in the past in London, and she basically wrote a kind of introduction or preface, basically framing the general questions around agonistic pluralism and how this then feeds into this research trajectory also on assembly. And one particular aspect that I'm very much interested in is this issue of proximity that I mentioned earlier. And it's an issue that actually stems from this, let's say, interrogation of these spaces that we visited in Kuwait, which I will show in a minute, but also looking at a lot of, let's say, political conflicts, especially in Europe, where I think a lot of issues could be not solved, but be made more, let's say, productive if that proximity would be more exploited. So Zara Alibaba, one of the contributors, who's also the co-director of the Winter School Middle East, wrote a really beautiful piece on Diwaniya as a space of reinstitution. So this is actually, let's say, probably one of the most historic historian kind of pieces in the book. But then there was always this idea to, let's say, try to frame things through practice. So, for example, when we talk about Diwaniya in the book, we also talk about it through actual examples of how to question this particular format through, in this case, the Winter School. So here we have a piece with Joseph that actually introduces the Diwaniya as a space of political exchange. But then there's other pieces like this one. I'm just showing a couple of examples where we basically discuss the findings of the Winter School in 2011, which was actually completely concentrating on this particular phenomenon. We also have this piece by Claudia Amelie and Vera on new democratic paradigms. Claudia is the director of Democracy Next, which is a really fantastic organization that I really invite you to check out. And Jesko Fezer, for example, writing about the community problem in design, which especially when considering the, let's say, interrogation of audiences and different audience techniques in terms of approach, it's a really brilliant essay. We also have one really super interesting conversation in there, which is kind of from the archives with Giancarlo De Carlo, which is also very much, let's say, at the core of questioning the role of the architect. And just as one last example, Pelin Tan's piece on horizontal alliances, which also very much questions this relationship of both authorship and audience. So I'm going to quickly dive a little bit into Diwaniya. So Diwaniya is basically a decentralized urban typology that exists in Kuwait and has been existed there since basically the days of nomadic culture. So basically during these days when there would be a kind of crossing of paths and the tents would be set up, there would always be one tent which was specifically organized for, let's say, information exchange and informal political debate. So throughout the development of urbanization in Kuwait, this kind of this phenomenon that started as a kind of informal concept then became really part of the official kind of urban planning. So in each street of Kuwait, there's always at least one Diwaniya, which is a typology that's basically plonked to an existing building from the outside. So it's in a way you could say the kind of, let's say, male antidote of the female typology of the courtyard. So the Diwaniya is attached to the house, so you actually never move into the house or into the building. You can access it from the outside. And sometimes it looks incredibly informal, like this one, which probably most of you would think of as a kind of cafe or tea house. But it's actually also one of these spaces. And if you wonder about this strangely kind of medical-looking device in the middle, that's a PlayStation. So there, it is very informal, but that's precisely the idea. So that you basically create a setting in which people feel very comfortable, where there's a certain, let's say, physical proximity, but at the same time also the possibility to briefly withdraw if you want to, so you can create your own little nooks or corners where you have discussions. But these spaces, and this was one of the reasons why Joseph and I got super interested in this, they exist on all sorts of levels and all sorts of scales, and also all sorts of, let's say, almost, let's say, professionalism. So if you look at this one, this is very informal, and this is, for example, next to a public market. And this one is a private Diwaniya by a very affluent Kuwaiti family, right by the ocean. And so here you already, I think, get a good idea about this general, let's say, spatial arrangement, or the kind of spatial questions that arise when you build, or rather when you set up these spaces. And it's essentially always the same. So you build a perimeter with an empty core, and people usually sit on the outside. Sometimes, of course, they cross over if they want to talk to someone else. But the really amazing thing about this setting is that you can address the entire group, but usually people are sitting closely, and usually they're also dimensioned in a way that when you sit closely between two people, you can actually have a conversation that cannot be overheard. And so this is also then, for example, reflected on the outside. So you have, in this case, this is the same family Diwaniya. So you have a kind of inside one when it's too hot, and you have for evening gatherings one outside. But you have also the same kind of settings in a, for example, refugee camp on the outskirts of the city. And you have also, let's say, more formalized versions of this. So this is, for example, the Diwaniya of the Fishermen's Union. And this, for example, is a super informal version at a street corner. So why is this actually important? I think for me, what's super interesting about this phenomenon is that you have a series of decentralized and scattered spaces in the city, and they seem very informal, yes, they are, but also they have a very, let's say, political function that is actually quite formalized. So the idea of these spaces is that in each, let's say, local district, people discuss the issues that are relevant for them in their private and public lives, and that the outcome of these discussions also makes it outside of these quite confined spaces. So actually, I mean, although there is an emir in Kuwait, there is actually also a democratically elected parliament. And so the representatives of the parliament, they actually also have particular areas in the city that they overlook, and they actually gather their information from these spaces. And this was something that we tried to investigate. So basically to juxtapose the, let's say, informal part and the formal part of these structures, and then show this in the film that we produced. We also, as a kind of side project, produced a series of printed matter documents, one which was this kind of small exhibition that we organized at Storefront in New York. But it basically led to a series of projects that, I mean, in a way are still ongoing, because most of my studio work is basically concentrating on this question of assembly. So it was really trying to figure out, on the one hand, what does it mean to stage discourse? And on the other hand, what can you actually do physically and socially without trying to do some kind of social engineering, excuse me, to enable conflict? So I'm just going to show you a couple of projects. So the first one is one from Manifesta Biennial in Murcia in Spain, which was called Backbench, which was a kind of parliamentary-like setting that we produced for a kind of curatorial gathering. For those of you who may be familiar with Manifesta, so it's a roaming biennial in Europe. So they're not connected to one particular city or geography, but they move. So every 2 years they pop up in a different geography. And in this particular edition, there were 4 different curatorial collectives, and you can imagine that they weren't, their kind of interests weren't exactly streamlined. So the idea of this project was to build actually a kind of discursive hub before the biennial, and then have these 4 curatorial collectives to go into a kind of dissensual discussion concerning the different conceptual framings of the research for the biennial. And this was then filmed, and the outcome of these films were then shown during the biennial using this parliamentary setting as a kind of prop and central gathering point during the biennial. Another project that I wanted to share with you is this very small project in a kind of ground floor space in Berlin that we did many years ago, which is called Archive Kabinett. And inside there's this space, which we call the sauna. And basically here the idea, I mean, one of the issues of the brief was to also create a space for lectures and public programming. And this institution, which is a kind of part gallery, part publisher, part bookshop, they have quite a substantial public programming. And for us at the studio, the question was, okay, how do we deal with these kind of small spaces, and how can we actually create a situation in there that people actually start to go into some kind of conversational mode, and actually doing this in a way, in a quite brutal way, so really like trying to enforce it. So in a way doing the exact opposite of what is usually happening in these kind of settings, where, you know, usually the first couple of rows are always empty because people always want an exit strategy to be able to leave the room if they don't like the lecture, which is fair enough, so you can leave if you don't like it. But there, the idea was that you basically create a setting where you can, of course, always leave if you want to, but it would be an extremely painful process because everyone would be aware that you're leaving, and also people would have to move, and you would, for at least for a moment, totally be the kind of center of attention. At the same time, also creating a situation where the sheer fact that you're in this space already creates a certain discomfort because it's very small. It gets incredibly hot also after a while. And also you have to sit, as you can see in this image, very close to one another. We've also tried different, let's say, iterations or versions in different other Biennial contexts, like this one at Performa, with whom we've worked for a couple of editions, trying to produce different Performa hubs for them, which was their kind of central gathering spot in Manhattan during the Biennial, which, for those of you who don't know, it's a performance art Biennial that's also decentrally organized, so they work with spaces all over the city, but they don't actually have their own space. So they always have to temporarily rent, mostly a kind of commercial ground floor unit, which we then, for 4 editions of Performa, turned into different kind of discursive hubs. And in this particular one, which I think it was 2013, the idea was to basically completely flatten the kind of hierarchy of the space. So to basically take all the programmatic elements that were part of the brief and to just basically chunk them into one space without any, let's say, real vertical separations. And through this kind of overlaying of the different programmatic aspects to also create conflicts between the different things that are happening at any one time, because they have, I mean, by the nature of the things that they're doing there, let's say always 3 or 4 things that are happening at the same time. So the idea was to see what happens when these things actually overlap and when they start to produce conversations between them. Also, to come back to this issue of proximity and discomfort, this was a space that we built for the Gwangju Biennale, also quite some time ago. But there the idea was to actually play with, let's say, wrong scale and see what happens if actually the relationship between the body and the kind of physical setting is slightly offset. So here, basically everything was slightly too small. So you can probably see it in some corners of the image, and also in these kind of booths upstairs, which were created to set up a number of conversations that took place over these 6 weeks of the Biennial. One project that I wanted to share with you concerning, let's say, the social dimension of gathering and the question of, let's say, programming versus physical design, and also a question of, let's say, how to mobilize budgets and to decide whether or not, let's say, the implementation of architectural or physical matter is actually the right decision. It's this project in Berlin that we did with the HKW, which is House of World Cultures, which was, I don't know if you're familiar with this building. It's actually a very interesting building that was donated by the US government slightly after to the city of Berlin, slightly after the East German government started building the wall. And so it was a very subtle move because they decided to produce basically a gold building that they chunked right next to the death strip of the Berlin Wall. And this building, which is an extremely public building and which has been housing this art institution ever since, at some point was, as a kind of curatorial move, stripped back to the original kind of setting when it was built. So over the years, there had been a lot of changes, and they basically got rid of all of this. And then they asked 10 artists and architects to come up with site-specific installations after the kind of rebuilding or the unearthing of the original state. So we decided to, we chose, can you actually see the curve? Yeah, okay. So we actually chose this kind of pavilion, which usually during the summer months, it's a kind of beer hall. It's where you go to grab a drink and to sit on the terrace, on the roof terrace. And each contributor got, of course, a budget to deal with, and we decided that rather than actually starting to build something on the terrace, we would actually create a series of quite dense programming for this for a number of weeks, especially weekends, where this space would basically become a kind of hub of the activities. So the project was called 19 Hours at the Kiosk. So these 19 hours were basically 19 hours that were heavily programmed during this duration. And the only thing that we physically changed was that on the inside of this space, which was very broadly speaking, I mean, this was the kind of general framing of this exhibition when they reopened the building, was on architecture and ideology. So we decided to basically turn this space inside into kind of library or archive on books that we thought were particularly relevant when it comes to, say, post-war, like post-Second World War, questions around architecture and ideology, or more ideology, I would say, but also partially architecture. And created this setting, which was also supposed to feel, let's say, rather uncomfortable for two reasons. One is that we basically just covered in a very cheap way we dismounted the beer taps, and we just covered everything with really cheap wood. And then everything was covered in black latex. So you can imagine the kind of smell when you walked into this place. But also you can see it here, we basically put two-way mirror foil on the windows, so that basically during the night you couldn't see out and during the day you couldn't see in. So when you're actually there investigating, you're always kind of on stage if you want. And what we then did was that we set up these series of events or public programming items that related to questions around architecture and ideology, and tried to create very intense and also sometimes very, let's say, intimate moments where discussions could take place in a kind of, let's say, safe space within the institution. And again, there was an idea similar to this project that we did for Performa, to see what happens if you start to overlay certain programmatic items that are actually happening at the same time. So here, the next 4 images that I'm going to show, they're all happening at the same time. So this is the general overview. Then you have something happening inside. Then you have a reading outside. Then you have a band playing while at the same time some artists are setting up a mural on the back wall, which at the time was actually facing Angela Merkel's office in Berlin. And on an institutional scale, we've been working quite a lot with, generally speaking, cultural institutions, and mostly the typical situation that where we become, let's say, active as a studio is a situation where there's a new director coming to an institution, and we help them to basically spatially revamp the buildings. So this is a project that we did for tWitte in Rotterdam. And I'm a big fan of building little, but hopefully something that's meaningful. So what we've done here, you can see the curve? Yeah. So you see this kind of line here. So the historic building was basically closed up until this line. So it was basically a wall that continued, or part of the facade that continued there. And our decision was to basically just cut out these kind of bottom sections and replace the glass, so that there would be a different kind of conversation starting between the pedestrian area on the outside and the inside of the institution, so that the programming would also become visible. We also built this set of 64 L-shaped units that can be set up by the audience depending on the kind of public programming activities that are taking place, and depending on the kind of, let's say, discursive necessities. So sometimes it's a single block, like kind of monolith, when there's nothing happening, and sometimes it actually creates kind of a series of small pods. Sometimes it's a situation like this. And one project that was also part of this series of iterations or spatial changes that we produced in and around the building was a space that we call the consensus bar, which is a space in between two spaces that are both used for administration. So one is for tWitte, which is an international art institution, or internationally, it basically shows the work of international artists in the city of Rotterdam, whereas the other one is the Kunsthalle of Rotterdam, which shows mostly work of local artists. And unfortunately, at the time when we were involved with this project, the two institutions weren't really in touch, let's say, very politely. So we decided that instead of turning this space in between into a kind of extension of the exhibition floor, we produced this space which is called the consensus bar, where basically as a kind of new rule to the institution, there was a programming which took place every Friday from 5 till 6, when all the staff members of both institutions had to meet in this space. And what you see here, that kind of looks like an altar, is a set of 3 fridges that were stocked with vodka. So the idea was that they basically get pissed together every Friday evening. Also, you see a kind of like a cloud that is falling down every 10 minutes, which at the time, or historically ever since the beginning of tWitte as an institution, used to be the logo of the institution and the building. So the idea was that this kind of consensus building was receiving some help from above every couple of minutes. One other aspect that I'm very interested in terms of design is the question of time and timelines, and how different things can play out differently over, let's say, a period of time, and also what it means to choose, let's say, the right moment to do something. So one, I mean, this is really not a project. This is really like something that happened somehow many years ago, together with Hans-Ulrich Obrist, the curator, when we were, after he had just moved from Paris to London, and we were working on a project together and never basically found time to meet. At some point, we figured out that probably the best time to meet would be if we do it super early in the morning, because then basically none of us would have any other meetings or any other things to do. So we started this as a basically series of work meetings at 6:30 at a local Starbucks, and then realized that this worked incredibly well, and we could also actually start to invite other people to come and join us to discuss things regarding the project. And then at some point we thought, okay, this could actually turn into kind of like a salon, which then we started to print business cards that we started handing out with the phone number of the Starbucks, which you can imagine after a while the people from Starbucks got a little bit unhappy about the fact that people started calling. And so this actually then very quickly also became let's say, a kind of structure that we use to have meetings in different places, in different, let's say, discursive arrangements, also in different cities. So these business cards, for example, are from Mexico City, but we also had other, let's say, geographies that became kind of productive in this way, but basically always with the idea that the only thing that you need is a coffee and a space to meet. And I mean, Starbucks was in a way a kind of placeholder, or at the time was the place where it was possible, but it then extended in many different kind of spatial contexts. And there's a kind of small work by artist Bettina Pusci, who made produced a glass for the coffee for us. Okay, so I'm going to end on 12 thoughts that hopefully summarize some of the activities that I'm interested in. 1, alienation. Is it possible to transplant debate into situations which by default create a setting that fosters spatial and therefore social friction in order to generate productive debate? 2, decentralization. Is it possible to introduce localized micro-parliaments that foster extended neighborhood debates in order for them to be trickled up the formal political ladder as a democracy of scales? 3, resources. How would such physical setting be constituted with less economic means, but retain the same political influence? 4, orientation. Is it possible to insert essential outsiders into situations which are primarily governed by a pre-consensual status quo? 5, choreography. Is it possible to generate a physical object that by scale and location produces a contemporary datum for the central debate, one which allows for programmatic and physical standoff between different political camps? 6, proximity. Is it possible to generate situations of presence that foster transparency while exacerbating political debate? 7, friction. Any spatial situation is driven by underlying conflicts. Those can be designed or happen spontaneously. In any case, they will always alter the narrative of the situation. 8, institution. Any hardware requires a software. How can one consider the structural and institutional components that play an integral role in terms of how public architecture can perform? When do the opening hours become programmatic? 9, support structure. What constitutes the bare physical minimum in order to create a public situation from which to generate debate? 10, camp. How can one consider physical and non-physical forms and formats of design that together form a hybrid typology as a direct response to both spatial and organizational needs? 11, enablers. How can a specific physical scale be merged with a series of uneasy triggers in order to generate deliberate zones of conversational and performative friction? 12, pandemic. Since the beginning of the lockdowns, no one has the answers. Thank you.